Chapter 1. The Collision Course. July 1st, 1863. A humid, hazy dawn breaks over the fields and ridges surrounding the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and clover, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the distant lowing of cattle. It is a peaceful, pastoral scene, a place of quiet crossroads and modest farms, utterly unaware that it is about to become the epicenter of a nation's agony. On a long, low rise of ground west of the town, known as McPherson's Ridge, a man squints into the morning light. He is Brigadier General John Buford, commander of the 1st Division Cavalry Corps of the Union Army of the Potomac. He is a tough, seasoned veteran from Kentucky, a man who prefers action to words, and at this moment his senses are on high alert. His dismounted troopers, armed with single-shot breech-loading carbines, are spread thin, forming a skeletal line of defense along the ridge and in the fields below. They are not meant to fight a battle here. They are the eyes and ears of the army, a screening force tasked with finding the enemy. And they have found him. Through his field glasses, Buford can see them. They are coming from the west down the Chambersburg Pike, a long, dusty column of gray and butternut-clad infantry, the vanguard of General Robert E. Lee's formidable Army of Northern Virginia. They are marching with a confident swagger, the victors of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, an army that has seemed, for 2 long years, invincible. They believe they are marching to seize a supply of shoes rumored to be in Gettysburg. They have no idea they are marching toward the entire Union Army. Buford understands the gravity of the situation with chilling clarity. He knows that the ground he now holds is critical. The ridges, the hills, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, the long spine of Cemetery Ridge, this is what strategists call good ground, high ground, defensible ground. If Lee's army seizes it first, the coming battle could be lost before it even truly begins. The fate of the Union Army, and perhaps the nation itself, rests on whether his 2 small brigades, fewer than 3,000 men, can hold back the tide that is coming. He turns to one of his officers, his voice low and steady, a grim prophecy hanging on every word. He is thought to have said something to the effect of, "They will attack you in the morning, and they will come booming." A subordinate, perhaps seeking reassurance, might have questioned the wisdom of engaging such a superior force. But Buford's resolve was iron. He knew what had to be done. The enemy had to be delayed, held at bay, for as long as humanly possible. He needed to buy time. Time for the Union infantry, the powerful 1st Corps under Major General John Reynolds, to march up from the south and secure the heights. Every minute his men could hold this ridge would be a minute purchased in blood, a minute that could alter the course of the war. Down below, along Willoughby Run, the first shots ring out. A sharp crack, then another. Lieutenant Marcellus Jones of the 8th Illinois Cavalry, having borrowed a carbine from a sergeant, rests it on a fence post, and fires at a distant group of mounted officers. It is a symbolic act, the first shot of a battle that no one had planned to fight here. But history is not always made by design. Sometimes it is forged in the crucible of accident, in a collision of forces at an unremarkable crossroads. The Confederate infantry, men from Major General Henry Heth's division, deploy from their marching column into lines of battle. They are dismissive at first, believing they are facing nothing more than local Pennsylvania militia, easily brushed aside. But the fire that greets them is sharp, rapid, and accurate. Buford's troopers are using their breech-loading carbines to devastating effect, firing 3 or 4 times faster than a man with a muzzle-loading rifle. They fire, fall back, take cover, and fire again, making their small numbers seem far greater than they are. The Confederate advance slows, then stalls. The generals are confused. This is not militia. This is disciplined, professional resistance. The battle for Gettysburg has begun, not with a grand charge or a thunderous artillery barrage, but with a stubborn, bloody holding action on a ridge west of town. John Buford watches, his face a mask of concentration. He knows his men cannot hold forever. The pressure is immense, the gray lines growing thicker, longer, overlapping his flanks. He keeps looking south, down the Emmitsburg Road, praying for the sight of blue-clad infantry. He is buying time, but the cost is rising with every passing moment. Men are falling. The air is growing thick with the acrid smell of black powder. The pastoral quiet of the morning has been shattered, replaced by the grim percussion of war. The small town of Gettysburg, whose citizens are now huddled in their cellars, listening to the terrifying crescendo, is about to be seared into the memory of the world. And on that ridge, a lone cavalry general has just made one of the most important decisions of the American Civil War. He has chosen the battlefield. Now all he can do is hope the army arrives in time to fight on it. The minutes feel like hours. The Confederate pressure intensifies. Hith's division, then Pender's, begins to push forward with grim determination. They are the tip of the spear of A.P. Hill's entire corps. Behind them, another corps under General Richard Ewell is approaching from the north. The Union cavalry is being squeezed in a vise. Buford's line bends, but it does not break. His men understand the stakes. They are fighting for more than just a piece of ground. They are fighting for a chance for the army to form, to consolidate on the hills that Buford has identified as the key to victory. Just when it seems his line must collapse, a rider gallops up, his horse lathered in sweat. It is a messenger from General Reynolds. The First Corps is coming. They are double-quicking up the road, just a few miles away. A wave of relief, cold and sharp, must have washed over Buford. He has done it. He has held the ground. Help is on the way. But as the first elements of the Union infantry, the famed Iron Brigade, begin to arrive and deploy into line, the nature of the battle changes instantly. It is no longer a cavalry skirmish. It is now a full-blown infantry engagement. The scale of the violence is about to escalate exponentially. The collision course set in motion weeks earlier by decisions made in Richmond and Washington has reached its destination. Two great armies, the mightiest ever assembled on the North American continent, are beginning to converge on this small Pennsylvania town, drawn by the sound of the guns. The fight for McPherson's Ridge was just the opening act. The bloody drama of Gettysburg was only just beginning, and no one, not Buford, not Heth, not even Robert E. Lee himself, could possibly imagine the terrible cost of the next 3 days. The worst was yet to come. Chapter 2. The Audacious Gamble. To understand how two armies found themselves locked in a death struggle in the fields of Pennsylvania, we must rewind the clock. The year is 1863, and the Confederacy is at a crossroads. In the West, General Ulysses S. Grant has the vital Mississippi River city of Vicksburg in a stranglehold. Its fall seems inevitable, an event that would sever the Confederacy in two and be a catastrophic blow to the Southern cause. In the East, however, the picture is vastly different. Here, the Army of Northern Virginia, under the command of the brilliant and revered Robert E. Lee, seems an unstoppable force. In May at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Lee had achieved his masterpiece. Outnumbered more than 2-1, he had divided his army in the face of the enemy, sent his trusted corps commander, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, on a daring flank march, and utterly routed the Union Army of the Potomac. Then under the command of Fighting Joe's Hooker, it was a stunning victory, one that sent shockwaves through the North and bolstered the already legendary reputation of Lee and his men. But the victory came at a terrible price. Stonewall Jackson, the aggressive, relentless instrument of Lee's will, was accidentally shot by his own men and died days later. Lee, upon hearing the news, was devastated. He wrote, "I have lost my right arm." The loss was more than personal. It was strategic. Jackson's genius for rapid movement and brutal, decisive action was irreplaceable. His absence would be keenly felt in the weeks and months to come. In the wake of Chancellorsville, with morale in his army soaring but the strategic situation for the Confederacy worsening, Lee conceived of an audacious plan. He would not sit and wait for the Union Army to recover and attack him again in Virginia. The war had ravaged his home state, its farms stripped bare, its infrastructure shattered. He needed to move the war north. He proposed a full-scale invasion of Pennsylvania. The objectives were manifold. First, it would take the pressure off war-torn Virginia, allowing its fields to recover during the crucial summer growing season. His army could live off the rich, untouched farmland of the North. Second, it would disrupt any Union plans to send reinforcements to the West to help Grant at Vicksburg. Third, and perhaps most importantly, a decisive victory on Northern soil could shatter the already fragile morale of the Union. It could fuel the growing anti-war movement, strengthen the hand of the Copperheads Northern Democrats who advocated for a negotiated peace, and perhaps even convince foreign powers like Great Britain and France to finally recognize the Confederacy and intervene on its behalf. It was a high-stakes gamble. Lee was betting everything on the offensive power of his army and his own strategic genius. He would be marching deep into enemy territory, his supply lines stretched thin, with the massive Army of the Potomac shadowing his every move. But Lee had supreme confidence in his men. He believed them to be invincible, capable of achieving anything asked of them. As he told one of his generals, "There never were such men in an army before. They will go anywhere and do anything if properly led." The plan was approved by Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and in early June, the Army of Northern Virginia began to move. 75,000 strong, they slipped away from their positions opposite the Union Army at Fredericksburg, marching west toward the Shenandoah Valley, using the Blue Ridge Mountains as a screen. Meanwhile, in the Union camp, confusion reigned. General Hooker was unsure of Lee's intentions. Was it a feint, a full-scale raid, or the beginning of a major invasion? He dispatched his cavalry to probe the Confederate positions, leading to the largest cavalry battle of the war at Brandy Station on June 9th. While technically a Confederate victory, the engagement was a shock to the vainglorious Confederate cavalry commander, General J.B. Stuart, whose horsemen were surprised and fought to a standstill by the previously maligned Union troopers. It was a sign that the Union cavalry was coming of age. As Lee's army pushed north through the Shenandoah, Hooker's Army of the Potomac, nearly 95,000 men, began its own march north, moving parallel to the Confederates, always keeping itself between Lee and the capital city of Washington, D.C. It was a grand strategic chess match played out across the landscapes of Virginia and Maryland, two immense armies, moving like thunderclouds, their paths destined to intersect. Lee's army crossed the Potomac River into Maryland and then pushed into Pennsylvania. For the soldiers in gray, it was a land of unbelievable plenty. They marveled at the fat cattle, the full barns, the prosperous towns untouched by war. They seized livestock, food, and supplies, paying in worthless Confederate currency, or more often, simply taking what they needed. For the citizens of Pennsylvania, it was a time of terror. Refugees streamed eastward, and panic gripped the state capital of Harrisburg. But as Lee moved deeper into enemy territory, a critical problem emerged. He was blind. J.B. Stuart, his flamboyant and trusted cavalry chief, had been given discretionary orders. Instead of staying close to the main army and acting as its eyes and ears, screening its movements and reporting on the enemy's location, Stuart embarked on a grandiose raid around the entire Union army. While he captured wagons and caused a stir, his grandstanding adventure left Lee completely in the dark. For days, as he concentrated his army around the town of Cashtown, Lee had no reliable information on the whereabouts or strength of the Army of the Potomac. It was a catastrophic failure of intelligence at the worst possible moment. The Union Army, meanwhile, was undergoing its own crisis of command. General Hooker, who had so confidently boasted of his plans before Chancellorsville, was now losing his nerve. He clashed repeatedly with his superior general-in-chief Henry Halleck in Washington. The arguments culminated in a dispute over the garrison at Harper's Ferry. Frustrated and feeling unsupported, Hooker rashly offered his resignation on June 27. To his shock, President Abraham Lincoln, who had long harbored doubts about Hooker's leadership, accepted it immediately. In the dead of night on June 28, just 3 days before the largest battle of the war, a messenger from Washington arrived at the tent of Major General George Gordon Meade. Meade was a competent, professional, if somewhat unassuming and famously ill-tempered corps commander. The messenger woke him with the astonishing news that he was now in command of the entire Army of the Potomac. Meade was stunned, protesting that he was not the right man for the job, but the order was from the president. He had no choice but to accept. It was a monumental responsibility, thrust upon him at the most critical juncture of the war. He was taking command of a massive army, on the march in enemy territory, with a legendary opponent somewhere in the vicinity. He knew little of Hooker's plans or the exact disposition of his own forces. He wrote to his wife that he felt he was moving like a man in a dream. Yet Meade was a methodical and determined soldier. He quickly grasped the situation and began issuing orders. His first priority was to find Lee's army and bring it to battle, but on ground of his own choosing. He prepared a defensive line along a creek in Maryland, the Pipe Creek Line, and ordered his army to concentrate there. But armies are not chess pieces, and events have a momentum of their own. Lee, still blind without Stuart's cavalry, finally learned from a spy that the Army of the Potomac had crossed the river and was closing in on him, much faster and closer than he had anticipated. He realized his scattered corps were in danger of being defeated in detail. He immediately issued orders for his army to concentrate at once, near the crossroads town of Cashtown. One of his divisions under General Heth was already there. On the last day of June, Heth sent a brigade toward a nearby town to search for supplies, particularly shoes. That town was Gettysburg. They were turned back by what they reported as Union cavalry. The next morning, July 1st, Heth decided to march his entire division to Gettysburg to brush aside the supposed militia and seize the supplies. It was a seemingly minor decision, a probe, not an intention to start a major battle. Lee himself had given strict orders to his subordinates not to bring on a general engagement until the entire army was concentrated. But the Union cavalry waiting on McPherson's Ridge was not militia. It was the veteran division of John Buford, and George Meade's orders to concentrate on Pipe Creek were about to be overridden by the sound of gunfire. The audacious gamble that began in the halls of Richmond was now hurtling toward its unforeseen climax. Not in a carefully chosen defensive position, but in a chaotic, desperate encounter at a Pennsylvania crossroads that neither commander had selected, and neither was prepared for. Chapter 3. The Unwitting Crossroads. The last days of June 1863 were a period of profound and escalating anxiety across the North. The unthinkable had happened. Robert E. Lee and his seemingly invincible army were on Union soil. Newspapers printed frantic headlines, their columns filled with a mixture of patriotic defiance and thinly veiled panic. In Philadelphia, citizens dug trenches and erected barricades. In Harrisburg, the state capital, government archives were packed into crates and shipped away for safety. The fear was palpable, a creeping dread that the war, so long a distant affair fought on Southern fields, had finally come home. For the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac, the march north was a grueling ordeal. The summer sun was relentless. The roads choked with dust kicked up by tens of thousands of marching feet. Water was scarce, and the men suffered from exhaustion, dehydration, and blistered feet. Yet their morale was surprisingly high. After years of fighting to defend Washington or invade Virginia, they were now marching to defend their own homes. They were in friendly territory, greeted by cheering citizens who offered them fresh water, baked goods, and words of encouragement. This was a different kind of war now. It was personal. They were no longer the invaders. They were the defenders. A sense of grim purpose settled over the army. Despite the recent disaster at Chancellorsville and the sudden bewildering change in command, they were ready to fight. They had a score to settle with Lee's army. The commander who had inherited this vast, weary yet determined force, George Meade, was a study in focused pressure. The old snapping turtle, as his men sometimes called him for his short temper, was working tirelessly to get a handle on the immense machine that had been dropped into his lap. He was poring over maps, receiving a constant stream of reports from his corps commanders, trying to discern Lee's intentions from the confusing and often contradictory intelligence. His plan to establish a defensive line along Pipe Creek was sound military thinking. It was a strong position, and it would force Lee to attack him on ground of his choosing. But the plan presupposed that he had time, that he could control the movements of his 7 sprawling infantry corps and guide them to their designated positions before Lee struck. It was a plan that relied on order in a situation rapidly descending into chaos. The catalyst for this chaos was the absence of J.A.B. Stuart. While Meade was receiving a steady flow of information from his own cavalry and local spies, Lee was operating in an information vacuum. Stuart's ride around the Union Army had become a source of immense frustration for the Confederate High Command. Lee was uncharacteristically agitated, repeatedly asking his staff, "Have you heard anything from General Stuart?" He knew the Army of the Potomac was near, but he did not know precisely where, how strong it was, or in which direction it was moving. This lack of intelligence forced him to be more cautious than he would have liked. He had ordered his army, spread out across a wide swath of southern Pennsylvania, to concentrate. General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps was to the north, near Carlisle and York. General A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps was to the west, near Cashtown. And General James Longstreet's 1st Corps, Lee's most experienced and reliable unit, was behind Hill, bringing up the rear. The designated concentration point was Cashtown, nestled at the foot of South Mountain. Gettysburg, a town where 10 roads converged, was just a few miles to the east. It was a geographical magnet, a natural point of intersection for armies on the move, and it was there on the evening of June 30th that the first threads of the two armies began to touch. A brigade from General Heth's division, part of Hill's corps, had marched toward Gettysburg from Cashtown. As they approached, they saw Union cavalry. Not wanting to violate Lee's orders against starting a major fight, the brigade commander, Johnston Pettigrew, withdrew his men and reported the contact to his superiors, Heth and A.P. Hill. They dismissed the report. It couldn't be Union Army cavalry, they reasoned. It must be a local militia, easily scattered. The next morning, July 1st, Heth, a general eager to prove himself, sought and received permission from his corps commander, A.P. Hill, to take his entire division to Gettysburg to get those shoes. Hill, who was feeling unwell that day, gave his assent, still believing it was a minor affair. This decision, made on the assumption of faulty intelligence, was the spark that would ignite the inferno. The Union cavalry they had seen was, of course, John Buford's division. Buford was an exceptional soldier, and he understood the strategic importance of terrain better than most. When he arrived in Gettysburg on June 30th, he immediately recognized that the high ground south and east of the town, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge, was the decisive point. It formed a natural defensive position, shaped like a fishhook, that would be incredibly difficult for an attacking army to take. He knew, with an instinct honed by years of experience, that this was where the inevitable battle should be fought. He sent word to his nearest infantry support, General John Reynolds and the 1st Corps, some miles south in Marsh Creek, urging him to come to Gettysburg and informing him of his intention to hold the ridges west of town to delay the Confederate advance. It was a bold move for a cavalry commander, essentially dictating the location of a major battle to his superiors. But it was the correct move. As dawn broke on July 1st, the stage was set for an accidental yet monumental confrontation. Heath's division, marching east, was on a collision course with Buford's cavalry, dug in and waiting. Ewell's Confederate Corps was marching south toward the same point, the Union 1st Corps under Reynolds, and soon the 11th Corps under Oliver O. Howard were racing north toward the sound of the guns. Armies that had been groping for each other for days were suddenly being drawn into the vortex of Gettysburg. The town itself was a picture of bewildered innocence. Its 2,400 residents were overwhelmingly pro-Union, and they had watched with apprehension as Confederate patrols had passed through in the preceding days. Now the distant sound of gunfire from the west sent a new wave of fear through the streets. People peered from their windows, watching as wounded Union cavalrymen were brought back into town. They could not have known that their homes, their churches, and their fields were about to become the backdrop for the most violent and consequential battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. The pressure was building with every passing minute. The initial skirmish between Buford's men and Heth's advance guard was escalating rapidly. The Confederates, realizing they were facing determined opposition, began to deploy more and more troops. The boom that Buford had predicted was becoming a reality. The crackle of carbines was being drowned out by the roar of musketry and the deep-throated cough of artillery. The gathering storm had finally broken. The unwitting crossroads of Gettysburg, a place known for its carriage works and its Lutheran seminary, was now a killing ground. And as the first Union infantrymen of the Iron Brigade arrived on the scene, marching at the double quick, the commitment was sealed. There would be no turning back. The battle that neither Lee nor Meade had planned for was now underway, and it would develop a terrible, uncontrollable momentum of its own. It would consume men, leaders, and plans with an indiscriminate fury, leaving only sacrifice and consequence in its wake. Chapter 4. Commanders in the Crucible. A battle is more than a clash of armies. It is a clash of wills, a test of character under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The fate of nations can turn on a single decision made by a single man, sleep-deprived, burdened by responsibility, and shrouded in the fog of war. At Gettysburg, the destinies of 2 armies, and the country itself, rested on the shoulders of a handful of commanders, each a complex mixture of brilliance, ambition, and human frailty. At the head of the Army of Northern Virginia was Robert E. Lee. By the summer of 1863, he was more than a general. He was an icon, a symbol of the Confederate cause. His soldiers revered him, affectionately calling him Marse Robert. They would follow him anywhere. His string of victories against long odds had created an aura of invincibility around him and his army. But the Lee who rode into Pennsylvania was not the same man who had won at Chancellorsville. He was 56 years old, and the immense strain of the war was taking its toll. He was suffering from what was likely heart disease, experiencing chest pains and physical exhaustion. More than his physical health, he was grappling with the loss of Stonewall Jackson. This forced a major reorganization of his army, from 2 large corps into 3 smaller ones. His new corps commanders, Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill, were fine division leaders, but were unproven at this level of command. They did not have the same intuitive understanding of Lee's intentions that Jackson had possessed. Lee's leadership style was one of delegation and discretion. He would give his subordinates a general objective and trust them to carry it out. This system had worked wonders with Jackson. But with new commanders, in a fast-moving and uncertain campaign, it would prove to be a critical weakness. Lee's greatest challenge at Gettysburg would be translating his strategic vision into coordinated action on the battlefield. His confidence in his men, bordering on overconfidence, may also have clouded his judgment. He had come to believe they were capable of anything, and this belief would lead him to order an attack that many, including his most trusted subordinate, thought was impossible. That subordinate was Lieutenant General James Longstreet, commander of the 1st Corps. Longstreet was Lee's old warhorse, a steady, deliberate, and brilliant defensive general. He was a methodical planner, a man who believed in positioning his troops on strong ground and forcing the enemy to attack him. In the weeks leading up to Gettysburg, Longstreet had been advocating for a different kind of strategy. He urged Lee to adopt a strategic offensive tactical defensive plan, invade the North, yes, but find a strong defensive position, fortify it, and dare the Union Army to assault them, where they could be destroyed just as they had been at Fredericksburg. Lee had listened but ultimately rejected this advice. He believed in the power of the attack, in seeking out and destroying the enemy army. This fundamental disagreement over strategy would simmer between the two men throughout the campaign, coming to a head on the second day of the battle in a tense and fateful debate. Longstreet was loyal to Lee, but he was also filled with a deep sense of foreboding. He did not like the look of the ground at Gettysburg, and he did not like the idea of attacking the Union Army on its own chosen heights. His caution would be seen by some as insubordination, but to Longstreet, it was simply sound military sense. The man tasked with stopping this legendary duo was George Gordon Meade, thrust into command just days before the battle. Meade was in an unenviable position. He lacked Lee's charisma and the deep personal bond with his troops. He was known for his sharp tongue and professional, no-nonsense demeanor, but beneath his prickly exterior was a tough, resilient, and intelligent commander. He was not a brilliant tactician on the level of a Napoleon, but he was a master of logistics and organization. He understood how to move and supply a vast army, and he had a good eye for defensive ground. Unlike his predecessors, Meade was not intimidated by Lee's reputation. He was cautious and methodical, determined not to make a mistake that would endanger his army or the nation. His primary goal was to preserve his force and repel the Confederate invasion. He was not looking for a glorious, sweeping victory as much as he was determined to avoid a catastrophic defeat. His leadership at Gettysburg would be defined by his steady hand in a crisis, his ability to react to his opponent's moves, and his willingness to trust the judgment of his key subordinates on the field. One of those key subordinates was Major General John Reynolds, commander of the 1st Corps. Reynolds was one of the most respected and capable officers in the Union Army. He was aggressive, decisive, and beloved by his men. It was Reynolds who made the critical decision on the morning of July 1st to commit his entire corps to support Buford's cavalry, transforming the skirmish into a major battle. He understood instantly what Buford had seen, that the high ground was the key, and it had to be held at any cost. His presence on the field that morning electrified the Union troops, but his tenure at the battle would be tragically short. Another indispensable figure was Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, commander of the 2nd Corps. Known as Hancock the Superb, he was a magnetic and inspiring leader, a man who seemed to thrive in the chaos of battle. When the Union line collapsed on the first day, it was Hancock whom Meade sent forward to take command, rally the broken units, and organize a new defensive line on Cemetery Hill. Hancock's judgment, courage, and sheer force of personality would be instrumental in saving the Union Army from disaster and establishing the strong defensive position that would prove crucial on the following days. On the Confederate side, the new Corps commanders would face their own tests. Richard Ewell, who had inherited most of Stonewall Jackson's old corps, was a fine soldier but had lost a leg in a previous battle, and was still adjusting to his prosthetic and his new level of command. He was known for his aggressive spirit, but at a critical moment on the evening of the first day he would display a fatal indecisiveness. A.P. Hill, commander of the 3rd Corps, was another excellent division commander who was plagued by illness during the battle. His sickness on the first day may have contributed to the piecemeal and uncoordinated nature of the initial Confederate attacks. These were the men upon whose shoulders the fate of the battle would rest. They were not abstract figures on a map, but human beings subject to fear, doubt, pride, and exhaustion. Lee, the audacious gambler, betting on one more decisive victory. Longstreet, the cautious pragmatist, haunted by the feeling that the gamble was a mistake. Meade, the steady engineer, desperately trying to hold his army and the nation together. Hancock, the charismatic hero, rising to the occasion in a moment of crisis. Their decisions, their arguments, their strengths, and their flaws would be thrown into the crucible of Gettysburg, and the results would echo through American history for generations to come. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the first act of the tragedy was already unfolding with brutal speed. Chapter 5. The first day's fury. The morning of July 1st had begun with a cavalry skirmish. By midday, it had erupted into a full-scale, savage battle, a chaotic and desperate struggle that would set the stage for all that was to come. The arrival of General John Reynolds and the Union 1st Corps on McPherson's Ridge had stabilized Buford's crumbling line, but it had also raised the stakes immensely. Reynolds, recognizing the critical importance of holding the ridge to buy time for the rest of the army to concentrate on the heights behind him, acted with swift and decisive energy. As the lead brigade of his corps, the legendary Iron Brigade, composed of regiments from Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana, stormed onto the field, Reynolds personally directed them into the fray. Clad in their distinctive black hardy hats, the men of the Iron Brigade were known throughout the army for their fighting prowess. They crashed into a Confederate brigade under General James Archer, which was advancing through a wooded area known as Herbst Woods. The fighting was brutal at close quarters, a maelstrom of smoke, noise, and confusion. In the midst of this chaos, as he urged his men forward, General Reynolds slumped in his saddle and fell from his horse, killed instantly by a bullet to the back of the head. The Union Army had lost one of its finest commanders within the first hour of the infantry engagement. The loss was a staggering blow, but there was no time to mourn. The fighting in Herbst Woods surged back and forth. The Iron Brigade, despite their shock and grief, lived up to their name. They not only halted Archer's attack, but enveloped his brigade, capturing Archer himself, the first Confederate general to be captured since Lee took command, and hundreds of his men. To the north of the Chambersburg Pike, another Confederate brigade under Joseph Davis, the nephew of the Confederate president, was having more success, routing a Union brigade and forcing its survivors to take refuge in an unfinished railroad cut. But a counterattack by the 6th Wisconsin of the Iron Brigade and other regiments turned the tables. In a furious and bloody assault, the Union troops trapped Davis's men in the railroad cut, a deep trench with steep sides. Caught in a deadly crossfire, hundreds of Confederates were forced to surrender. The initial Confederate assault had been bloodily repulsed. There was a temporary lull in the fighting, a moment for both sides to catch their breath and reassess. The Union had held the ridge, but at a terrible cost. The Iron Brigade had suffered over 50% casualties in the morning's fight. The fields and woods were littered with the dead and wounded. As the Union 11 Corps, commanded by General Oliver O. Coward, began to arrive on the field, the Union position seemed to be solidifying. Howard, now the senior Union officer on the field following Reynolds' death, deployed his own corps to the north of the town, extending the Union line to face a new threat. Confederate General Richard Ewell's corps was arriving from the north, its lead elements spotted on the road from Carlisle. The Union line now formed a wide, vulnerable arc west and north of Gettysburg. It was a line that was too long for the number of troops available to hold it. Howard established his headquarters on Cemetery Hill south of the town, recognizing its importance as a rallying point should the front lines collapse. That collapse was not long in coming. In the mid-afternoon, the Confederates renewed their attack, this time with overwhelming force. From the west, Heth's and then Pender's divisions of Hill's corps slammed into the remnants of the Union I Corps on McPherson's Ridge. From the north, 2 divisions from Ewell's corps, under Generals Robert Rhodes and Jubal Early, descended upon the exposed right flank of the Union 11 Corps. The 11 Corps was composed largely of German immigrants, and they carried the unfair stigma of having broken and run at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Despite fighting bravely for a time, they were hit from the front and the flank simultaneously. Outnumbered and unsupported, their line buckled, then shattered. A trickle of retreating soldiers soon became a flood. The collapse of the 11 Corps uncovered the flank of the 11 Corps, which had been stubbornly holding on to its position on the ridge. Now, they too were forced to fall back to avoid being surrounded. The retreat quickly became a rout. Thousands of Union soldiers, disorganized and demoralized, streamed back toward Gettysburg, desperately trying to reach the relative safety of Cemetery Hill. The streets of the town became a scene of utter chaos. Blue-clad soldiers clogged the narrow lanes, trying to escape the pursuing Confederates who were pouring in from the west and north. Many Union soldiers got lost in the unfamiliar streets and were captured. It was a disaster, a complete Union collapse. From his vantage point on Cemetery Hill, General Howard watched in horror as his army disintegrated before his eyes. He tried desperately to rally the fleeing troops, to form a new line of defense, but the panic was too great. It seemed as if the battle, and perhaps the campaign, was lost. At this critical moment, a new figure arrived on the scene, General Winfield Scott Hancock. Meade, hearing of Reynolds' death and the escalating battle, had sent Hancock, his most trusted subordinate, forward with orders to take command of the field, assess the situation, and decide whether Gettysburg was the right place to make a stand. Hancock arrived to find the scene of the rout. With his commanding presence and booming voice, he seemed to be everywhere at once. He rode among the broken units, rallying stragglers, shouting encouragement, and directing them to new positions on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. His personal bravery and sheer force of will had an immediate calming effect. Soldiers who had been fleeing in terror stopped, turned, and began to reform their ranks. Hancock, with Howard's assistance, began to lay out a new, powerful defensive line on the heights south of town, the very ground that Buford had identified as critical that morning. The pursuit by the Confederates, meanwhile, had lost its momentum. They were disorganized and exhausted from their long march and hard fight. As they reached the edge of Gettysburg, they saw the Union troops rallying on the formidable heights of Cemetery Hill, bristling with artillery. General Lee himself had arrived on the field and saw the scene. He recognized the opportunity. If he could press the attack and seize Cemetery Hill before the Union could fortify it, he could win the battle then and there. He turned to the commander of the victorious corps on that part of the field, Richard Ewell. Lee's order was not a direct, peremptory command. it was discretionary. He sent a message to Ewell, suggesting that he should carry the hill if practicable. That phrase, if practicable, would become one of the most debated in the entire war. Ewell, the new corps commander, hesitated. His men were tired. The Union position looked strong. He was unsure of what enemy forces might be on the far side of the hill. He conferred with his subordinates, including the fiery Jubal Early, who urged him to attack. But Ewell, accustomed to the explicit orders of Stonewall Jackson, was unaccustomed to the discretion Lee had given him. He chose not to attack. He decided it was not practicable. That decision may have been the single greatest mistake made by the Confederates at Gettysburg. The opportunity was lost. As dusk fell, the fighting died down. The first day was over. It had been a resounding Confederate victory in tactical terms. They had shattered 2 Union Army corps, inflicted thousands of casualties, and driven their enemy from the field. But strategically, the outcome was far more ambiguous. The Union Army had been battered, but not broken. And thanks to the foresight of Buford, the sacrifice of Reynolds in the I Corps, and the decisive leadership of Hancock, they now held the high ground. They occupied a superb defensive position, a fishhook-shaped line running from Culp's Hill, south along Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, to a rocky hill known as Little Round Top. As the rest of the Army of the Potomac marched through the night to reinforce this line, and as Lee's army concentrated in the town and on Seminary Ridge opposite them, the stage was set for the second, and bloodiest, day of the battle. The fury of the first day was but a prelude. Chapter 6. The Devils to Pay. The morning of July 2nd dawned hot and tense. The two armies, now almost fully concentrated, faced each other across a mile of open fields, separated by the Emmitsburg Road. The Union Army, its ranks swelling as corps after corps arrived throughout the night, was now dug in on the strong defensive ground Hancock had chosen. The line resembled a fishhook, the barb at Culp's Hill and Spangler's Spring to the east, the curve over Cemetery Hill, and a long straight shank running south along Cemetery Ridge for nearly 2 miles, ending at 2 rocky wooded hills, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. It was a formidable position, and George Meade, having arrived on the field around midnight, approved of it. He had a decision to make: stay and fight on this ground, or retreat to his previously planned Pipe Creek line. After consulting his generals, the decision was made. The Army of the Potomac would stand and fight at Gettysburg. On the opposite ridge, Seminary Ridge, General Lee was planning his attack. His goal was to dislodge the Union Army from the heights. He intended to launch a massive, coordinated assault on both Union flanks simultaneously. General Ewell's corps would attack the Union right flank at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, while the main effort, led by General Longstreet's corps, would strike the Union left flank, aiming to roll up the line from south to north along Cemetery Ridge. Lee believed that if he could break both flanks, the Union center would collapse. It was a sound plan, but its execution would be plagued by delays, miscommunication, and bitter disagreement. The main attack was to be led by James Longstreet, and he was deeply opposed to the plan. He had spent the morning scouting the Union position, and was convinced that a frontal assault on the Union left would be a suicidal bloodbath. He argued passionately with Lee, once again urging him to adopt his preferred defensive strategy: swing the army around the Union left flank, find a strong position between Meade's army and Washington, and force Meade to attack them. Lee was unmovable. "The enemy is there," he said, pointing toward Cemetery Ridge, "and I am going to attack him there." Longstreet, deeply frustrated, reluctantly began to prepare his troops for the assault. He would later write, "Never was I so depressed as on that day." The preparations for Longstreet's attack took far longer than Lee had anticipated. The troops had to be marched a long circuitous route to get into position without being seen by Union signalmen on Little Round Top. It was mid-afternoon, nearly 4 o'clock, before the Confederate assault finally began. This long delay gave the Union Army precious hours to strengthen its position. It also meant that the planned simultaneous attack on the other flank would not happen. Ewell was ordered to begin his attack only when he heard the sound of Longstreet's guns, ensuring the Confederate attacks would be sequential, not simultaneous, allowing Meade to shift troops from one part of the line to another to meet each crisis as it arose. But the greatest complication on the Union side came from one of their own generals. The commander of the Third Corps, Major General Daniel Sickles, was a controversial figure, a former New York politician who had been acquitted of murder before the war. Tasked with holding the southern end of Cemetery Ridge, Sickles became concerned that a slight rise in the ground in front of him, near the Emmitsburg Road, was a better position. Without orders, and in direct violation of Meade's plan, Sickles moved his entire corps of 10,000 men forward, off the ridge, and into an exposed salient. His new line ran from a rocky, boulder-strewn hill called the Devil's Den, through a blood-soaked field of wheat, to a peach orchard along the Emmitsburg Road. He had created a massive bulge in the Union line, disconnected from the corps on either side of him and impossible to defend. When Longstreet's attack finally crashed forward, it was Sickles' isolated corps that bore the brunt of the assault. The fighting that erupted on the south end of the battlefield was some of the most savage and confused of the entire war. The divisions of Confederate generals John Bell Hood and Lafayette McLaws slammed into Sickles' line. The battle raged for hours in the Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard. These places became slaughter pens, with control surging back and forth as both sides fed more and more brigades into the vortex. Regiments were shattered, commanders fell, and the fields were carpeted with the dead and dying. General Sickles himself had his leg shattered by a cannonball. As his corps was being annihilated, a new crisis was developing. In moving his corps forward, Sickles had left the key to the entire Union left flank, the hill known as Little Round Top, completely undefended. Lee's attacking brigades, particularly those from Hood's division, saw the opportunity. If they could seize that hill, they could place their artillery on its summit and fire directly down the length of the entire Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The battle would be over. The Union Army's chief of engineers, General Gouverneur K. Warren, had ridden to the summit of Little Round Top to survey the situation. He was horrified to find it occupied by only a handful of signalmen. He saw the glint of Confederate bayonets in the woods below, a line of battle moving to assault the hill. In a desperate panic, Warren sent his aides racing for the nearest available troops. The man they found was Colonel Strong Vincent, a brigade commander in the V Corps, which was moving up to support Sickles' collapsing line. On his own initiative, understanding the supreme importance of the moment, Vincent diverted his brigade and rushed his 4 regiments up the southern slope of Little Round Top, deploying them just minutes before the Confederate attack struck. The last regiment to get into line, holding the extreme left of the entire Union Army, was the 20th Maine, commanded by a 34-year-old college professor named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Chamberlain was told to hold the position at all costs. He and his 386 men were the end of the line. There was nothing to their left but the rest of North America. If they retreated, the Confederate Army would pour around the flank and the Union Army would be doomed. For the next hour and a half, the 15th Alabama Regiment, commanded by Colonel William C. Oates, launched a series of ferocious assaults up the rocky, wooded slope. The men of the 20th Maine fought back with equal ferocity. The fighting was hand-to-hand, a desperate struggle with rifles, bayonets, and rocks. Casualties mounted on both sides. The 20th Maine's line was bent back on itself, but it never broke. Finally, with a third of his men down and their ammunition almost completely gone, Chamberlain knew he could not withstand another assault. In a moment of extraordinary inspiration, he made a decision that would become legendary. He ordered his men to fix bayonets. As the exhausted Alabamians began their next charge, Chamberlain gave the command. The 20th Maine, with a great shout, charged down the hill, a swinging door of steel that swept away the stunned and exhausted Confederates. The attack on Little Round Top was broken. The Union flank was saved. While the fighting raged on the left flank, Ewell's corps finally began its assault on the Union right at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. The attacks were fierce but uncoordinated. A desperate struggle took place in the growing darkness on the slopes of Culp's Hill, which was defended by the Union 12th Corps. On East Cemetery Hill, a Confederate charge by Louisiana and North Carolina troops managed to break through the Union line and seize some artillery batteries, but a determined Union counterattack, led personally by General Hancock, drove them back in a chaotic nighttime battle. By the time darkness finally put an end to the slaughter, the second day of Gettysburg was over. It had been the bloodiest day of the battle, and one of the bloodiest in American history. The Union line had been stretched, battered, and nearly broken, but it had held. The Confederates had made gains at Devil's Den and the Peach Orchard, and had secured a foothold on the lower slopes of Culp's Hill, but they had failed to achieve their objective. They had not broken the Union flanks. Lee's grand plan had been thwarted by delays, poor coordination, and the incredible, desperate courage of the Union soldiers. As the surgeons went to work in their ghastly field hospitals, and the cries of thousands of wounded men filled the night air, the commanders on both sides knew that the issue was not yet decided. There would be one more day. One more chance for Lee to achieve the decisive victory he so desperately sought, and he had already decided where the final blow would fall. Chapter 7. The High Water Mark. The night of July 2nd was a hellish tableau of suffering. Across the miles of contested ground, thousands of wounded men lay in agony, their cries for water and help echoing in the darkness. The air was heavy with the smell of blood and black powder. Both armies were exhausted, shattered by the ferocity of the day's combat. In the Union headquarters, a small farmhouse behind the lines, General Meade convened a council of war with his corps commanders. He was still the new commander, and he wanted their counsel. One by one, he polled them. Should the army stay and fight, or should they retreat? The answer was unanimous and resolute. They would stay, they would hold their ground. When asked if the army should attack the next day, the consensus was to wait, to let Lee attack their strong defensive position one more time. The decision was made. The Army of the Potomac was not going anywhere. In the Confederate camp on Seminary Ridge, a very different conversation was taking place. Robert E. Lee was determined to press the attack. He believed that the Union Army had been severely weakened by the previous day's assaults, and that one more powerful blow would shatter them. His plan for July 3rd was simple and direct. The attacks on the flanks on July 2nd had failed. Therefore, he would attack the Union center. He reasoned that Meade must have weakened his center to reinforce his flanks, leaving it vulnerable. He would assemble a massive assault force, nearly 12,500 men drawn from Longstreet's corps and Hill's corps, and launch them directly at the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The target was a small clump of trees that marked a slight salient in the Union position. James Longstreet was appalled. He argued vehemently against the plan, believing it was doomed to fail. To send infantry across nearly a mile of open level ground under the concentrated fire of the entire Union artillery was madness. He pleaded with Lee to reconsider, to return to the plan of maneuvering around the Union flank. But Lee's mind was made up. His blood was up. His belief in the invincibility of his infantry was absolute. He brushed aside Longstreet's protests. The attack would go forward. Longstreet, in despair, was tasked with organizing it. He gave the command of the assault to one of his division commanders, Major General George Pickett, a flamboyant Virginian whose fresh division had not yet seen any fighting at Gettysburg, though it would become known to history as Pickett's Charge. It was a combined force. Pickett's 3 brigades would form the right of the attacking column, while 6 brigades from A.P. Hill's corps, under Generals Johnston Pettigrew and Isaac Trimble, would form the left. The morning of July 3rd passed in an eerie, suspenseful quiet. The day began with a fierce fight to retake the trenches on Culp's Hill that the Confederates had captured the previous evening. A brutal 7-hour struggle that ended with the Union regaining full control of their right flank. But on the main front, along the 2 ridges, an unnatural calm settled over the field. Soldiers on both sides refilled their cartridge boxes, cleaned their rifles, and waited. The heat was oppressive, the tension unbearable. They knew something was coming. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the silence was shattered. From the Confederate line on Seminary Ridge, 2 signal guns fired in succession. It was the prelude. Immediately, more than 150 Confederate cannons opened fire simultaneously, unleashing the largest artillery bombardment ever witnessed on the American continent. The earth shook. A deafening continuous roar filled the air as shells screamed across the valley and slammed into the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. The goal was to soften the Union line, to destroy its artillery batteries, and demoralize its infantry in preparation for the charge. The Union artillery, under the command of the brilliant General Henry Hunt, initially answered with its own barrage, but after a short time, Hunt, wanting to conserve ammunition for the infantry assault he knew was coming, ordered his guns to cease fire. The Confederate artillerists, seeing the Union guns go silent, believed they had succeeded. They thought they had knocked out the Union batteries. They were tragically mistaken. At around 3 o'clock, the Confederate bombardment slackened. The moment had come. From the woods along Seminary Ridge, the Confederate assault force emerged. It was a magnificent, terrifying sight. 12,500 men, arranged in a line more than a mile wide, their battle flags snapping in the breeze. They began their march forward, their alignment as perfect as if on a parade ground. As they moved into the open fields, the Union artillery that the Confederates thought was destroyed roared back to life. General Hunt had ordered his guns to hold their fire for this exact moment. Now, from Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top, dozens of cannons opened up on the advancing gray line. Solid shot tore great gaps in the ranks. Exploding shells ripped men apart. The Confederate soldiers closed ranks and pressed on, their courage unshakable. They crossed the Emmitsburg Road, climbing over the fences that lined it, which further disordered their lines. Now they came within range of the Union infantry, crouched and waiting behind a low stone wall on the ridge. The Union soldiers, men from Hancock's the 2nd Corps, held their fire until the last possible moment. When the Confederates were just a few hundred yards away, a sheet of flame erupted from the stone wall. Thousands of rifles fired at once, a devastating volley that staggered the advancing line. The charge became a desperate, chaotic rush toward the wall. The smoke was so thick that men could barely see. The noise was a physical blow. The Confederate line began to melt away under the storm of lead and iron. Men fell by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Yet some of them made it. A few hundred Confederates, led by General Lewis Armistead, who had put his hat on the tip of his sword to rally his men, broke through the Union line at a slight bend in the wall known as the Angle. For a few brief, desperate moments, they stood on Cemetery Ridge, planting their flags on the crest. It was a moment of incredible bravery, the furthest point the Confederacy would ever advance into the North. It was the high water mark of the rebellion, but it was a fleeting triumph. Union reinforcements rushed to the breach, swarming the beleaguered Confederates. A furious swirling melee of hand-to-hand combat erupted around the captured Union guns. General Armistead was shot down. The Union line held. The survivors of the charge, their leaders down, their organization shattered, had no choice but to retreat. The charge had failed. The retreat was a scene of horror. The open fields were a killing ground. The Union artillery continued to fire into the broken mob of fleeing men. Of the nearly 12,500 men who had made the charge, more than half were killed, wounded, or captured. It was a catastrophe. As the shattered remnants of his division stumbled back to the Confederate lines, General Pickett was inconsolable. Lee rode out to meet the survivors, his face a mask of anguish. "It is all my fault," he said, over and over again. "It is all my fault." He told Pickett to rally his division for a possible Union counterattack. Pickett, his voice choked with emotion, is said to have replied, "General Lee, I have no division now." The Union counterattack never came. Meade, his army also battered and exhausted, chose to be prudent. He had won a great defensive victory. He would not risk it by launching a risky assault of his own. As the sun set on July 3rd, the guns finally fell silent. The Battle of Gettysburg was over. The field was a landscape of unimaginable carnage, but the Union was saved. Lee's invasion was broken. The audacious gamble had failed. Chapter 8. A field of sorrows. The end of the fighting did not bring peace. It brought a profound, horrific silence, punctuated by the sounds of human misery. As darkness fell on July 3rd, the battlefield of Gettysburg was transformed into a vast, open-air hospital and morgue. An estimated 51,000 men from both armies were killed, wounded, or missing over the 3 days of battle, nearly a third of all the forces engaged. It was the costliest battle of the Civil War, a butcher's bill on a scale that stunned the nation. The fields where the great charges had taken place were now littered with the bodies of the dead, contorted in the final agonies of death. They lay in rows where the battle lines had stood, and in grotesque piles where the fighting had been most desperate. Horses, too, lay dead and dying, their silent testament to the indiscriminate nature of the slaughter. But for every man killed, many more were wounded, and their ordeal was just beginning. Across the battlefield, an army of surgeons and stretcher-bearers went to work by the faint light of lanterns. The task was overwhelming. Every church, every barn, every public building, and many private homes in and around Gettysburg were converted into makeshift field hospitals. They were places of unimaginable horror. The floors were slick with blood. Piles of amputated limbs grew outside the surgeons' tents. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and chloroform. The surgeons, exhausted and overwhelmed, worked for days without rest, performing hundreds of operations in the most primitive of conditions. For many of the wounded, medical care came too late, or not at all. Thousands lay on the field for days after the battle, suffering from their wounds, from thirst, and from the sweltering summer heat. The cries of these men, a constant agonizing chorus, haunted those who were tasked with their care. The small town of Gettysburg, with its 2,400 residents, was suddenly faced with caring for over 20,000 wounded men. The citizens responded with extraordinary compassion, offering food, water, and comfort to the soldiers of both armies. Women became nurses, tearing up their own bedsheets for bandages, cooking what little food they had, and sitting with dying men, writing final letters to their families. The day after the battle, July 4th, was Independence Day, but there was no celebration. The two armies remained in their positions, watching each other warily, too exhausted and battered to renew the conflict. A heavy rain began to fall that afternoon, a dismal, drenching downpour that washed the blood from the grass, but added to the misery of the wounded men lying exposed on the field. For Robert E. Lee, it was a day of grim reality. His army was shattered. He had lost a third of his fighting force, including many of his most experienced commanders. His invasion was over. His only option was to retreat, to save what was left of his army, and get it back to the safety of Virginia. That evening, under the cover of the drenching rain and darkness, the Great Retreat began. It was an agonizing procession, a 17-mile-long train of wagons, filled with the wounded who were well enough to be moved, started the slow, torturous journey south. Every jolt of the wagons on the muddy roads was an agony for the wounded men inside. A Confederate officer described the sounds coming from the wagon train as a wail of misery, a chorus of groans and screams that was perfectly appalling. The rest of the army followed, slogging through the mud, their spirits as dark as the stormy night. They had marched into Pennsylvania with an air of invincibility. They were leaving in defeat, their confidence broken. George Meade and the Union Army began a cautious pursuit. Meade has been heavily criticized by history, and by President Lincoln at the time, for not being more aggressive, for not launching an all-out attack on Lee's retreating army, and destroying it once and for all. Lincoln was furious, exclaiming, "We had them in our grasp. We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours." But Meade's perspective was different. His own army was severely battered, with over 23,000 casualties. His men were exhausted. He was short on supplies and ammunition, and Lee's army, though defeated, was still a dangerous fighting force. When Lee reached the Potomac River, he found it flooded by the recent rains, trapping him on the north bank. For a few tense days it seemed that Meade might have his chance. The Union Army closed in. But before Meade could organize a final, decisive assault, the river level dropped, and Lee's engineers constructed a pontoon bridge. On the night of July 13th, the last elements of the Army of Northern Virginia slipped across the river, back into the South. The Great Invasion was officially over. Back in Gettysburg, the work of cleaning up the battlefield had begun. It was a gruesome task. Thousands of bodies had to be buried. Due to the heat and the sheer number of dead, most were interred in shallow mass graves on the field where they fell, their final resting places marked, if at all, by a simple wooden headboard. The stench of death hung over the town for weeks. The process of identifying the dead was heartbreaking and often impossible. But for the Union, there was a sense that these men should not be forgotten, that their sacrifice demanded a more fitting tribute. A local attorney, David Wills, proposed the creation of a national cemetery, a final resting place for the Union soldiers who had died to preserve the nation. The state of Pennsylvania purchased 17 acres on Cemetery Hill, the very ground that had been the keystone of the Union defense. The work of disinterring the bodies from their crude battlefield graves and reburying them in the new cemetery began. It was a somber, sacred task. Each grave was to be a testament to the cost of the victory. The field of sorrows was slowly being transformed into a field of honor. But the memory of the battle, the images of the slaughter, the sounds of the suffering would remain etched in the minds of the soldiers and civilians who had witnessed it. The war would go on for nearly 2 more years, but something had fundamentally changed at Gettysburg. The aura of Confederate invincibility was shattered. The tide of the war had turned, and on a hill overlooking the fields where so much blood had been shed, a stage was being set for an orator who would give meaning to the sacrifice, and in just 272 words redefine the very purpose of the American nation. The aftermath of the battle was not just about burying the dead, it was about understanding why they had died. Chapter 9. A New Birth of Freedom. The immediate consequence of the Battle of Gettysburg was a profound wave of relief that washed over the North. The threat of Lee's army had been neutralized. The invasion was over. Washington was safe. The victory was celebrated with cannon salutes and ringing church bells in cities and towns across the Union. The news from the West, arriving on the same day, July 4th, compounded the sense of triumph. Vicksburg had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. In the span of 24 hours, the Confederacy had suffered 2 devastating strategic blows from which it would never fully recover. The Mississippi River was now entirely in Union hands, splitting the Confederacy in 2, and in the east, the Army of Northern Virginia had been dealt a crippling defeat. The turning point of the war had been reached. For the Confederacy, the news from Gettysburg was a bitter pill. The initial reports had been optimistic, claiming a great victory. But as the truth of the failed charge and the subsequent retreat filtered south, a pall of gloom descended. The defeat was a severe blow to Southern morale, both on the home front and within the army. The confidence that had been so high after Chancellorsville was replaced by a grim defensive determination. While the war was far from over, the hope of a single decisive victory that would win Southern independence had been extinguished in the fields of Pennsylvania. The strategic impact was immense. Never again would Robert E. Lee be able to mount a major offensive operation on the scale of the Gettysburg campaign. For the remainder of the war, the Army of Northern Virginia would be forced to fight a defensive war, reacting to Union initiatives, its manpower and resources slowly and inexorably ground down by the superior numbers and industrial might of the North. The possibility of foreign intervention, which had seemed so tantalizingly close, vanished completely. Great Britain and France, seeing the twin defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, concluded that the Confederacy could not win the war and solidified their positions of neutrality. The South was now truly alone, but the most profound and lasting impact of Gettysburg was not strategic, but ideological. It came 4.5 months after the battle, on a cold, windswept day in November. The occasion was the dedication of the new Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg. The organizers had planned a grand event with a famous orator, Edward Everett, scheduled to be the main speaker. As something of an afterthought, they sent an invitation to President Abraham Lincoln, asking him to provide a few appropriate remarks to formally consecrate the ground. Lincoln saw the invitation not as a secondary role, but as a profound opportunity. He had been deeply frustrated with Meade for letting Lee's army escape, but he understood the magnitude of the victory. More importantly, he saw the immense sacrifice made at Gettysburg as a chance to redefine the purpose of the war for the American people. The war had begun as a conflict to preserve the Union, to hold the states together, but with his Emancipation Proclamation, issued earlier that year, Lincoln had begun to shift its focus. The war was now also a struggle for human freedom. At Gettysburg, he would cement that transformation. Lincoln worked carefully on his speech, crafting it with a poet's precision. On November 19, 1863, he stood on a platform overlooking the rows of new graves. Edward Everett had just finished his speech, a magnificent classical oration that lasted for 2 hours. Then the president rose. He was tall and awkward, his voice high-pitched. He spoke for just over 2 minutes. He began by invoking the nation's founding, not with the Constitution, but with the Declaration of Independence. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. With this opening, he connected the struggle of the Civil War directly to the ideals of the American Revolution. He framed the war as a great test, to see whether that nation or any nation founded on such principles could long endure. He honored the men who had fought and died on the field, stating that their actions had consecrated the ground far above our poor power to add or detract. And then he came to his powerful conclusion. He urged the living to take from these honored dead and increase devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. He called for a rededication to the task of winning the war, so that the dead shall not have died in vain. And he gave that task its ultimate meaning, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people by the people for the people shall not perish from the earth. The speech was so short that many in the crowd did not even realize it was over. The initial reaction was muted, but as the words were printed in newspapers across the country, their power and profundity began to sink in. With those 272 words, Lincoln had given the war its moral compass. He had transformed the bloody, divisive conflict from a war about preserving the Union as it was, into a revolutionary struggle to create a new Union, a nation reborn with a commitment to liberty and equality for all. He had given meaning to the 51,000 casualties. They had not died just to win a battle or stop an invasion. They had died in Lincoln's vision to save the promise of America itself. The Gettysburg Address became one of the most important speeches in American history. It reshaped the narrative of the war, and in doing so reshaped the nation's understanding of itself. The long-term impact of the battle, therefore, was twofold. On the battlefield, it marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. It was the turning point from which Lee's army could not recover. But in the realm of ideas, thanks to Lincoln's words, it marked a new beginning. It ensured that the Union that was eventually preserved would not be the same one that had gone to war. It would be a nation striving to live up to the ideals of its founding, a nation that had purchased a new birth of freedom with the blood of its citizens on a field in Pennsylvania. The battle decided more than the outcome of the war. It decided what kind of nation America would become. Chapter 10. Echoes on Hallowed Ground. The cannons fell silent. The armies marched away, and the dead were buried. But the story of Gettysburg did not end. The battle left an indelible scar on the landscape, and on the American soul. In the years and decades that followed, the battlefield evolved from a place of carnage and sorrow into a place of memory, reconciliation, and national identity. It became hallowed ground, a sacred text written in earth and stone, telling the story of the nation's greatest trial. Immediately after the war, veterans began returning to Gettysburg. They came to walk the fields where they had fought, to find the places where their comrades had fallen, and to try to make sense of the cataclysm they had survived. Small, simple markers began to appear, placed by survivors to commemorate the spot where their regiment had stood, or where a particular act of bravery had occurred. This grassroots effort soon grew into a more organized movement. Veterans associations, both Union and Confederate, raised funds to erect monuments. By the 1880s and 1890s, the battlefield was being populated by a forest of granite and bronze. Each monument told a story, a small piece of the larger epic, It marked the positions of regiments, brigades, and batteries, creating a detailed three-dimensional map of the battle. The creation of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, and later the establishment of Gettysburg National Military Park in 1895, ensured that the field would be preserved for future generations. It was one of the first battlefields in the country to be set aside for historical preservation, a recognition of its singular importance in the national story. The park was not just a museum, it was a classroom, a place where Americans could come to understand the cost and consequences of the Civil War. Perhaps the most powerful and poignant chapter in the post-war history of Gettysburg was the story of reconciliation. As the bitterness of the war began to fade with time, the men who had tried to kill each other on these fields began to meet again, this time as fellow countrymen. Great reunions were held on the battlefield, bringing together thousands of veterans from both the North and the South. The 25th anniversary in 1888 saw a remarkable gathering. Former Union and Confederate soldiers met at the stone wall at the Angle, the site of Pickett's charge. Men from a Philadelphia brigade who had defended the wall reached across it to shake hands with the Virginian survivors of Armistead's brigade who had attacked it. But the most famous of these reunions was the 50th anniversary in 1913. More than 50,000 veterans, most of them in their 70s and 80s, camped out on the old battlefield. The highlight of the event was the reenactment of Pickett's charge. The aging Confederate veterans began their slow walk across the field one more time. As they approached the stone wall, the Union veterans waiting for them did not raise their rifles. Instead, they opened their arms. The two lines met at the wall not with bayonets and musket butts, but with handshakes, tears, and embraces. It was a powerful symbol of a nation healing its wounds, of a brotherhood forged in the crucible of shared experience, even as enemies. This spirit of reconciliation, while deeply moving, also served to simplify the memory of the war. In the effort to honor the bravery of the soldiers on both sides, the underlying cause of the conflict, slavery, was often downplayed or forgotten. The narrative became one of tragic but noble sacrifice by white Americans on both sides, a narrative that often excluded the experiences and the central importance of African Americans to the story. The new birth of freedom that Lincoln had spoken of was a promise that remained, for many, unfulfilled. Today, Gettysburg remains a place of profound resonance. It is a meticulously preserved landscape of war, where one can stand on Little Round Top and imagine the desperation of Chamberlain's men, or walk the path of Pickett's charge and feel a sense of awe at the courage and folly of the attack. It is a place of quiet reflection, of rolling hills and silent monuments that stand as sentinels of memory. The battle itself was a story of contingency and accident, of ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances. It was a story of leadership and its failures, of incredible bravery and unspeakable suffering. It was 3 days of concentrated violence that did not end the war, but ensured that the Union would not be defeated. It confirmed that the conflict would be a long, brutal war of attrition, a war the industrial North was destined to win. The echoes of Gettysburg still reverberate through American life. It stands as a reminder of the fragility of the Union, and the terrible price paid to preserve it. It is a testament to the idea that history is not inevitable, but is shaped by the choices and sacrifices of individuals in moments of crisis. It is a field of sorrow, but also a field of honor. It is the place where the tide of the Confederacy was turned back, and where a president gave voice to the nation's highest ideals, challenging future generations to continue the unfinished work of creating a more perfect Union. The ground at Gettysburg is saturated with the past, a permanent and powerful reminder of the 3 days that decided the fate of a nation.